The northern pasture of the Foster Ranch lies flat and open in the early light, the high desert plateau stretching in every direction without interruption, the pale scrub grass running across the ground as far as the eye can carry. It is summer in New Mexico, somewhere in the last days of June or the first days of July, 1947. The elevation here sits close to 5,000 feet, and at this hour, the air still holds a coolness that the afternoon will take away entirely. A man on horseback moves through that light at an easy pace, following a route he has followed many times before, the horse reading the ground without instruction, while the rider watches the middle distance, the way a working man watches land he is responsible for, steadily, without urgency, looking for whatever the pasture has to say. His name is William Brazel, Mac to the people who know him. He is the foreman of this property, the J.B. Foster Ranch, a spread in Lincoln County, New Mexico, approximately 75 miles north of Roswell. His work takes him out across this land routinely through the dry summer mornings and the long afternoons, checking on the sheep, moving along the fence lines, reading the condition of the ground, the way people who work land their whole lives learn to read it, as something that communicates, if looked at steadily enough. This morning is no different from any other morning, at least not yet. The horse moves forward. The pale grass lies flat under a sky that is beginning to lighten from gray to a thin, clear blue at the edges. The man on the horse is somewhere in his early 50s, lean and weathered, the kind of man whose hands carry more information than his face. He rides without particular purpose, beyond the purpose of a foreman riding out to check the northern portion of his pasture on a dry summer morning in the high desert of New Mexico. The debris is not yet visible. There is only the open ground, the pale grass, the cooling air, and the horse moving through it. A man doing ordinary work in an ordinary place. That is the moment before. That is where the story rests, briefly, before it moves. When the fragments came into view across the ground ahead of him, Brazel would have registered them the way any working rancher registers something out of place in a familiar field, with a practical attention, not an alarmed one. Something was wrong with the pasture. Something was distributed across the surface of the ground that should not be there. The material caught what light there was, lying scattered across a broad area of the open rangeland, and from a distance it would not have named itself. From a distance it was simply out of place. He rode toward it. The debris field, when he reached it and began to move through it, covered a considerable area. The fragments were spread broadly across the ground, distributed across what witnesses and later investigators would estimate to be a substantial portion of the northern pasture, lightweight pieces of something lying where they had fallen on the pale caliche surface, and the dried grass distributed without apparent pattern across an open stretch of land that was otherwise unremarkable in every direction. Brazel dismounted. He walked among the pieces. He looked at them in the way a man looks at something that his experience should be able to name, but does not, quite. Some of what he found was thin and metallic in character, foil-like, catching the pale morning light when he lifted a piece of it from the ground. Some of it was dark and rubbery in texture, flexible strips of something that felt, in his hand, unlike the rubber he knew from tires or equipment, lighter, differently weighted. Some of it was composed of small structural pieces, light as balsa, but not balsa, nothing he could place immediately in any category, drawn from his experience of things that fell out of the sky onto ranch land in New Mexico. Brazel had found aircraft wreckage on the Foster Ranch before. The land was not far from military flight paths, and pieces of equipment were not unknown on a working ranch of this size. What was on the ground around him now was not that. It was not any configuration of materials he could group together and identify as a thing he had seen before, or heard about, or could account for by any practical reasoning available to a man in his position on a dry summer morning in the northern New Mexico desert. He picked up several pieces. He turned them in his hands. The thin foil-like material was not heavy. It lay across his palm without much weight to it, catching and releasing the early light as he tilted it. He pressed it between his fingers and felt the way it held. It did not behave the way he expected aluminum to behave, or tin, or any thin film of metal he had handled in the context of ordinary ranch work or ordinary equipment. It was simply a material in his hand that he could not name, spread across a considerable area of his employer's pasture in the northern New Mexico desert, and he was alone with it in the early morning, with no one to ask. The silence of that pasture in those minutes would have been nearly total. At 5,000 feet in the high desert, away from roads and towns and other people, the quiet is a physical thing. The horse nearby, the sound of its breathing, the very faint movement of air across the dry grass, and the debris lying across the ground in every direction around a solitary ranching man, waiting to be identified by someone with the knowledge to do it, which was not Mac Brazel, and which was not anyone else who would stand on this particular piece of ground that morning. He gathered what he could carry. He did not report the find immediately. This detail is worth holding for a moment, not because it suggests anything other than what it almost certainly was: the practical decision of a working man who had found something strange on a property he managed and needed time to think about what to do with it. People who work land in remote places learn to handle unexpected things methodically. The deliberate quality of what Brazel did next in the days following his discovery carries the recognizable texture of a practical intelligence working through an unfamiliar problem without rushing to a conclusion. He gathered samples. He stored them in a shed on the property. He showed the pieces to people he trusted, people who would give him an honest assessment. His son Vernon was among the first people Brazel showed the fragments to, along with Vernon's wife. They examined what Brazel brought them. They turned the pieces over, pressed the thin foil-like material, looked at the structural pieces, and arrived at the same place Brazel had arrived at in the pasture, without an identification, without a category to put the material into, without a name for what they were holding. The material's origin and composition sat outside anything the family had encountered, and it sat there without apology, waiting for someone who knew more to say something about it. The shed on the Foster Ranch property, in those first days of July 1947, would have been dry and dim inside, the heat of the New Mexico summer pressing against its walls, the interior smelling of wood and dust, and the dry mineral air of the high desert. A wooden surface with the gathered fragments laid out across it, foil pale and light, dark rubbery strips curved where they had rested before being gathered, small beam-like structural pieces arranged without particular order, the way things are laid out when the person laying them out is hoping that looking at them in proximity to one another might suggest a pattern or an origin that handling them individually had not. It was a practical arrangement made by a practical man who did not know what he was looking at and was trying, in the deliberate way of a person accustomed to solving concrete problems, to see it more clearly. The shed held the fragments for some days. Brazel went about the other work of the ranch. The debris in the northern pasture remained where it lay, most of it across the broad area of ground where it had come to rest before anyone found it. And Brazel turned the problem over in his mind, the way a man turns an unfamiliar tool in his hands, looking for the side of it that reveals its function. When he decided to show the material to someone outside his own family, he went to the neighboring property. Floyd Proctor and his wife Loretta ran a ranch not far from the Foster property, and they were the kind of neighbors that made sense to approach with an unusual question. People who had their own years of experience in this part of the desert, who knew what things looked like out here, and what things fell out of the sky, and what the wreckage of ordinary equipment felt like in the hand. Brazel arrived at the Proctor Ranch in the later part of the day, the sun lower in the sky by then, the light across the desert porch falling at the angle that belongs to late afternoon in the high New Mexico summer, warm and horizontal, showing texture in everything it touches. He held out a piece of the material toward Loretta Proctor. She took it, or she looked at it where he held it, and she turned it in her hands with the same attention that Brazel himself had brought to the pasture field on the morning of the discovery. Loretta Proctor's account of what she held that day was consistent in the years that followed. The piece Brazel showed her was thin and stiff. It was lighter than it appeared to be, lighter than the stiffness of it suggested. She attempted to cut it. The material resisted. She held it to what heat she had available to her, a match, or whatever small flame she could bring to it, and the material did not respond in the way she expected it to respond. It did not burn. It did not soften. It did not take any mark from the heat or from the blade. It simply remained what it was, thin and stiff, and light in the hand, unchanged by anything she brought to bear on it. She could not identify it. She said so. She had no name for what Brazel was carrying, and she was honest about that in the straightforward way of people who know what they know, and know equally well what they do not know. Floyd Proctor examined what Brazel had brought as well. He handled the material. He looked at the fragments with the attention of a man who has spent a working life in a part of the world where the military conducted tests and experiments across the wide open desert, where government balloons and instruments and occasionally pieces of experimental equipment came down out of the sky onto ranching land with some regularity. This was a region where weather balloons were a known quantity. Radar equipment was not unfamiliar. The idea that government projects sometimes left wreckage on private land was not a strange idea to a man who had lived and worked in this part of New Mexico for any length of time. Floyd Proctor looked at what Brazel had brought him, and he said what made practical sense to say. This might be from a government experiment. This might be a balloon. He advised Brazel to report what he had found to the sheriff in Roswell. The conversation on that porch carried the quality of a practical problem being worked through between two working men, the sun going down over the desert while they talked, the woman of the house having held the strange thin piece and reported honestly that she could not name it. There was no alarm in it. There was the careful, slightly wondering attention of people who had found something they could not account for and were now deciding what the correct next step was. Floyd Proctor's suggestion, go to the sheriff, report it, let the people with more resources look at what you have, was the logical conclusion of a practical conversation. Brazel acknowledged it. The afternoon light continued to move across the porch and the flat desert land beyond it. The fragments went back into Brazel's hands for the drive south. The drive from the Foster Ranch to Roswell in the summer of 1947 covered a distance that was not short. The unpaved ranch roads gave way eventually to paved highway, but only gradually. The land between the Foster property and the city of Roswell was open and wide, the kind of distance that made clear why a man might sit with an unusual discovery for several days before deciding to report it. There were no quick trips in this part of New Mexico in 1947. Going anywhere from the Foster Ranch meant committing to the drive, committing to the time and the fuel and the long road through the desert. When Brazel finally made that drive south toward Roswell in the first week of July 1947, he was making a deliberate choice. He would have sat in the cab of the truck with the fragments stored beside him or behind him, and the road ahead would have been long and straight, in the way that desert roads are long and straight, the horizon far away, the sky wide, the land on either side of the road, open in every direction, without interruption. A man in a truck moving south through the high New Mexico desert at whatever speed the road allowed, carrying something he could not identify in the hands of the most experienced people he had been able to reach without traveling all the way to town. The material was gathered and stored in the cab with him. The desert moved past on either side. The road ahead ran south toward Roswell. What Brazel was carrying toward the city in that truck cabin, in those hours of driving through the open land, was a practical problem he could not solve himself, and that no one he had shown it to had been able to solve either. Not his son, not his son's wife, not Floyd Proctor, who knew this country and its characteristic debris as well as anyone, not Loretta Proctor, who had held the piece in her own hands and found that it resisted every test she applied to it. The material remained unidentified. The question of its origin remained open, and Brazel was driving it south toward the one institution that Floyd Proctor had suggested might have more information than anyone on the Foster Ranch or its neighboring properties possessed, the sheriff's office in Roswell, and through the sheriff, whatever larger authorities the sheriff could reach. There was nothing alarming in that truck cab. There was only the road, and the desert, and the fragments, and the question the fragments carried with them, which was a practical question about what they were and where they had come from, and what a foreman was supposed to do about them. Brazel was not a man given to dramatic readings of situations, by any account. He was a man who worked land, who solved concrete problems, who relied on his own experience and the experience of people he trusted, and who, when his experience and theirs ran out, looked for someone with more knowledge to hand the problem to. That is what the drive south to Roswell was. That is what the first week of July, 1947 was, in the understanding of the man making the drive. The scrubland moved past on either side of the road. The sky above the truck was wide and blue, and beginning to shift toward the longer light of later afternoon. The miles between the Foster Ranch and Roswell passed under the truck's wheels in the gradual cumulative way that long desert drives pass. Nothing changed about the material beside him in the cab. It was exactly what it had been in the pasture. It was exactly what it had been in the shed, and in Loretta Proctor's hands, and on the wooden surface where Brazel had laid the pieces out to look at them. Unchanged. Light, thin, foil that did not fold, rubber that was not quite rubber, beam-like pieces of something that weighed almost nothing and had no name. In Brazel's experience, or in anyone else's that he had found to ask. The road ran south. The truck moved along it, and behind the truck, on the northern pasture of the Foster Ranch, the rest of the debris field lay exactly as it had lain since whatever morning it had come down out of the New Mexico sky and distributed itself across the pale caliche ground and the dry summer grass, quiet in the afternoon light, spread across a broad, still area of open rangeland, waiting with the patient quality of things that simply remain until someone with the right knowledge arrives to attend to them. That attention would come, in the days following Brazel's arrival in Roswell, from directions and institutions that he had not fully anticipated. The military installation south of town, the 509th Bomb Group at Roswell Army Airfield, was not an ordinary military base. It was, in the summer of 1947, the only atomic-capable air wing in the world. The personnel there were not ordinary personnel, and the attention they brought to what Brazel reported would not be the ordinary attention of a sheriff's office reviewing a piece of unusual wreckage found on a working ranch. But none of that was visible yet to the man in the truck driving south on the unpaved road. The fragments stored in the cab beside him, the desert spreading wide and flat in every direction. Brazel knew what he knew. He had found something he could not name in a pasture he was responsible for. He had held it, gathered it, stored it, shown it to the people closest to him and to the most practically experienced neighbors within reach. None of them had been able to name it either. He was going now to the people Floyd Proctor thought might know more. The decision was simple and logical, and carried the quality of a man doing what made sense to do with an unfamiliar thing in a part of the world where the nearest help was always some distance away. The road continued south through the open land. The light continued its slow movement across the desert on either side, and the question the fragments carried, quiet, practical, genuine, without drama, traveled with them in the cab of the truck as the miles accumulated and Roswell came gradually closer. A working man with an unanswered question, moving through the wide New Mexico afternoon toward a city that did not yet know it was about to be asked. The desert outside the truck's windows was the same desert it had always been: pale earth, dry grass, the long flat distance in every direction, the sky enormous above it all. Nothing in that landscape marked the moment as different from any other afternoon in any other summer. The road was the road, the light was the light, and the fragments rested in the cab without changing, without offering any new information, carrying only the question they had carried since the morning. A ranching man crouched beside them in the northern pasture and pressed the thin foil flat with his palm and watched it return, smooth and unmarked, to exactly what it had been. He had pressed it flat. He had watched it return. He had looked at it in the early morning light without a name for it, and then he had gathered it up and carried it toward the only kind of answer available to a man in his position, the answer of someone else's greater knowledge, further down the road. The truck moved through the afternoon. The desert received the light evenly across its wide surface. Mac Brazel drove south, and the question in the cab beside him, unhurried, specific, impossible to name, moved south with him through the open land toward Roswell, where it would be handed over to people with more resources and more institutional authority, though not, as it would turn out, with any more certainty about what the fragments were. The pale light of the high desert afternoon held everything in that wide, quiet, open land just as it held everything else. The truck on the unpaved road, the scrub grass on either side, the enormous sky above, and behind the truck many miles back now, the Foster Ranch's northern pasture with the remainder of the debris field still lying across its pale surface in the late summer afternoon, spread across the ground where it had come to rest, still waiting, still carrying its unanswered question into the dry, wide, silent air of the high New Mexico plateau. Jesse Marcel crouched on the ground of the Foster Ranch debris field in the early morning of July 8, 1947, and picked up a piece of the thin material from the pale surface of the pasture. The light was still low. The high desert air carried the particular dryness of a New Mexico summer morning, the kind that settles in the throat and clarifies the edges of everything visible at a distance. Marcel held the fragment in both hands and looked at it. It was not heavy. That was the first thing. The weight of it, or the near absence of weight, was the detail that every account returned to first. Not the surface, not the appearance, but the way the fragment seemed to register almost nothing in the palm, as though it displaced less air than its dimensions suggested it should. Marcel turned it over. The surface was smooth. Both surfaces were smooth. There were no visible stress marks, no scoring, nothing that looked like a manufacturing seam, nothing that established clearly which side had been the outer face and which the inner one. He pressed it flat against his thigh and watched it. The material sprang open. It did not merely relax back into shape. The return was immediate, smooth, and complete, as though the folding had not occurred. He pressed it flat again, held it a moment, and watched it open again with the same unhurried precision. The crease he expected to form at the fold line was not there. The surface was undisturbed. Marcel would describe this property in later accounts with care, taking time over the detail, as though the specificity of the description mattered to him, as though he wanted the account to be exact. He had handled metallic foil in a long military aviation career that included considerable work with aircraft wreckage and material analysis. He said the behavior of this material was unlike anything he had encountered. He did not say it in a way that suggested alarm. He said it in the way a careful man describes a fact that does not yet have a proper category. The morning light spread slowly across the debris field as Marcel moved through it. Fragments were distributed across an area of considerable size, scattered irregularly across the pale kali and scrub grass of the northern pasture. Some lay flat against the ground, almost invisible until the angle of the light caught a surface and held it. Others were partially embedded, or resting against small rises in the earth, or tangled in the low brush. There was no obvious center, no single place from which the rest appeared to have radiated, though the overall orientation of the field ran roughly northwest to southeast, and at the northern end of this spread, something had marked the earth itself. The furrow there was shallow, several inches deep. It ran in a narrow line that matched the general axis of the debris distribution, and its edges were clean rather than crumbled, as though whatever had produced the gouge had done so in a single pass. The earth in this region was not soft. The kali of the high desert plateau does not yield easily, and the shallow trench it had received was specific and distinct, visible in the morning light as a shadow running across the surface of the pasture from one end to the other. Marcel examined it. He did not know what to make of it, and the accounts he gave in subsequent years reflected that. He described it without interpretation, holding it at the level of a physical observation, leaving it as something that had been there on the morning of July 8th, 1947, in the northern pasture of the Foster Ranch, visible and factual, and without a ready explanation. He returned to the foil. There were many pieces of it, varying in size. Most were small, a few were large enough to lay flat across both forearms. Marcel moved from piece to piece through the field, crouching and rising, the desert floor dry and pale beneath him, and the sky widening overhead as the morning advanced. He noted that crumpling a fragment in the fist produced no lasting deformation. He noted that folding it sharply along a deliberate crease produced the same result. The crease vanished when the pressure was released, the surface recovering to flat and smooth as though the gesture had not been made. He tried this more than once. The result was the same each time. He kept trying, not because the result was inconsistent, but because the consistency itself was the thing he could not account for. No metallic foil he had worked with in years of military aviation held that property. Standard aluminum foil, creased standard radar reflector material, the kind used in the balloon configurations common to weather monitoring programs, creased, tore at stress points, and did not recover. This material did none of those things. Among the pieces of foil, Other material was present, and the debris field contained what Marcel and other witnesses described as lightweight structural members, pieces resembling the profile of small beams or struts, rectangular in cross-section, and in weight and dimension, suggesting something like balsa wood. They were not heavy. They were pale, smooth-surfaced, and in overall appearance not dramatically unusual. The kind of narrow rectangular structural piece that might have been found by sight alone in any number of lightweight fabricated assemblies. But the similarity ended at appearance. Marcel described attempting to snap one across his knee. The beam did not snap. He described the attempt as one made with genuine force, the kind of effort that would have broken a balsa strut of comparable dimension without difficulty. The beam flexed slightly and returned. It did not crack. It did not splinter. The surface showed no marks from the attempt. Jesse Marcel Jr. was 11 years old in July 1947. He was asleep in the family home in Roswell on the night of July 7, 1947, when his father arrived home late, carrying material from the debris field. The accounts Jesse Marcel Jr. gave throughout his adult life, in interviews, in recorded testimony, and in a book he co-authored and published while still living, were consistent in their particulars across many decades. He described being woken by his father. He described coming to the kitchen. He described the material laid out across the floor of the kitchen in the household quiet of that Roswell night, the rest of the neighborhood still and dark, and himself crouching on the linoleum and handling the pieces that his father showed him. He described the foil. He described crumpling it, watching it return to flat. He described the beam-like structural members, and he described something else, something that appeared along the inner surfaces of those beam pieces, the surfaces that faced inward along the structural member's concave face. What he described was markings, not text, or not text in any form he could read, not numbers, geometric shapes, he said in most accounts, or figures that resembled geometric shapes arranged in a pattern that suggested intentionality without resolving into a recognizable alphabet or symbol system. The color he described consistently across many years was a purplish or pinkish hue. The marks did not stand sharply against the pale surface of the beam, but were visible when the light struck the inner face at the right angle, a faint and distinctly non-random pattern running along the structural member's interior. Jesse Marcel Jr. maintained those accounts. He gave them in the 1970s, in the 1980s, and the 1990s, and into the 21st century, his descriptions holding the same shape across the interval of his adult life. He died in 2013. The accounts he gave are in the archive of the research that accumulated around this case, recorded on tape, transcribed in books, preserved in the collections of the investigators who interviewed him. They are still there. The boy on the kitchen floor in 1947, and the physician in his 70s speaking carefully to a camera decades later, described the same material in the same terms, with the same particular detail about the markings along the inner face of the beam, the same particular color named, the same specific property of the self-returning foil. He did not waver on these points. He was careful to say what he had seen, and equally careful not to say more. The tests came from multiple witnesses and multiple points of contact with the material. It was not only Marcel, and it was not only the Marcel kitchen. What is documented is that on more than one occasion, in more than one location, at the debris field, at the ranch, and at Roswell Army Airfield itself, attempts were made to damage the recovered material using methods that should have produced visible results on any conventional substance of comparable size and weight. The methods described in witness accounts were not elaborate. They were the kinds of tests a practical person applies to an unfamiliar material when the question of its composition is genuinely open. A knife blade, a hammer, a flame. The knife was a standard military issue blade. The account of the attempt to cut the foil-like material with this knife is specific. The handler pressed the blade against the smooth surface with genuine force, drew it in a cutting motion, and lifted it to look at the result. There was no mark. The surface was undisturbed, precisely as it had been before the blade contacted it. The attempt was made more than once, with the same result each time. In the dry air of the high desert summer, in whatever shed or structure was being used as a temporary examination space near the debris field, the blade was pressed and drawn again, and the material held without yielding. The hammer produced nothing. A sledgehammer applied to the foil-like material in the documented accounts left no depression, no deformation, no mark of any kind. The material was laid on a hard surface, the hammer brought down, and the material was examined after the blow. It was unchanged. This detail recurs in witness testimony with enough consistency that it enters the record as something worth noting, not as a dramatic anomaly, but as a physical observation that multiple people described independently, using similar language, across an interval of years that separates their accounts from any obvious coordination. A lighter flame was held to the surface of the foil. The documented accounts described the flame touching the material and producing no blackening, no discoloration, no curling, no melting. The material did not char. It did not take any mark from the heat. It was held in the flame and then examined in the light, and the surface was exactly as it had been before the test was conducted. A piece of standard aluminum foil held in a cigarette lighter flame for the same duration would have shown discoloration. Standard radar reflector material would have melted or deformed. Standard mylar would have blackened and contracted. What the accounts describe is a material that none of those things happened to. What it did instead was nothing. It sat in the flame and was unchanged, and the person holding it over the flame watched the result in the silence of that desert summer and had no explanation for what they were seeing. The scale of the debris field is worth holding for a moment. Researcher reconstructions based on the field witness accounts, and in particular on the testimony of Jesse Marcel Sr., who examined the field himself on the morning of July 8th, placed the debris scatter at roughly 3/4 of a mile in length. The width was several hundred feet at its widest point. This is not a small area. Standing at one end of the field and looking toward the other, the far boundary would have been at the limit of clear vision, or beyond it. The fragments distributed in between, across the pale open ground of the high desert pasture, without any obvious clustering or concentration, simply spread the way something distributes itself when it arrives across a distance and a trajectory rather than being placed. The orientation was northwest to southeast. The shallow furrow at the northern end of the field, the gouge in the caliche earth, the narrow mark that ran with the axis of the distribution, sat at the head of this arrangement. Marcel noted it. His accounts described it as a feature consistent with some initial contact with the ground at the northern end, a first point of engagement, before whatever produced the scatter continued in its trajectory and left the rest of the material across the 3/4 of a mile that followed. He was careful, in his accounts, not to say what had produced the gouge. He described it as a physical feature that was there. He noted its dimensions, its direction, its edges. He described it in the same way he described everything else from that morning, as something he had observed, held in the category of observation, and carried forward in his memory without imposing a conclusion on it. The desert in the early morning of July 8th, 1947, was quiet in the way that high desert rangeland is quiet, which is to say, not silent, but empty of human sound. The absence of machinery and traffic, and the ordinary texture of a populated place, giving the natural sounds of the land a quality that is different from silence. There would have been wind, or the absence of wind. There would have been birdsong at that hour, or its intermittent presence. The pasture grass, pale and short, moved or did not move. Marcel worked through the field in this quiet, picking up pieces of material, examining them, setting them down, or retaining them. The sky above him was the wide blue of a New Mexico summer morning and was growing lighter and bluer as the hours passed. He was an experienced intelligence officer with years of military aviation behind him. He had examined wreckage before. He knew what aircraft materials looked like when they had been through stress, impact, heat, or structural failure. He knew what weather balloon equipment looked like, the polyethylene, the foil radar reflectors, the balsa framework of the reflector targets. He knew the feel of those materials, the way they responded to handling, the marks they left on surfaces, and the marks surfaces left on them. He said the material in the Foster Ranch debris field did not match any of those categories. He said this in interviews beginning in the late 1970s, when he broke 30 years of silence about his role in the retrieval. He said it consistently, in account after account, until the end of his life. There is no way to step outside what Marcel reported and access the material directly. The fragments themselves, whatever they were, wherever they originated, are not available for examination. What survives in the record is the testimony of the people who handled them, Marcel's accounts, his son's accounts, and the accounts of other named witnesses who touched and tested material in those first days of July 1947. The testimony is not uniform in every detail. The accounts were given at different times by people with different roles and different proximities to the central events, and they carry the normal variation of human memory across a span of decades. But certain details repeat. The foil that returns to flat, the beams that do not snap or splinter, the surfaces that do not cut, do not dent, do not char. These elements appear across accounts given independently by different people at different points in the half-century of research that followed the summer of 1947. Jesse Marcel Sr. sat on the ground of the debris field with a piece of the foil in his hands and folded it and watched it open again. This happened. He reported it. The report is still in the record, in the interviews he gave to Stanton Friedman beginning in the late 1970s, in the accounts preserved in the archives of Roswell Research, in the recordings made before Marcel's death. Whatever the material was, whatever category it properly belongs to, whatever account of its origin is correct, the act of crouching on that pale desert ground and pressing the foil flat and watching it open is a documented event. Marcel described it with the precision of a man who wanted to be understood correctly. He described it the same way, in the same terms, across multiple interviews given over the years his accounts were being recorded. He was not given to exaggeration in other areas of his testimony. On the question of the foil, he was specific, he was consistent, and he was clear. The morning continued. The light rose to full. The debris field lay across the pasture in both directions from wherever Marcel crouched or stood, its contents scattered and still, the pale material catching the New Mexico sun and then not catching it as the light shifted across the open ground. There was no one else nearby at that particular moment. The accounts suggest Marcel moved through the field at points alone, in the way that investigators sometimes work a site carefully and without distraction, picking up one piece, holding it, setting it down, moving to the next, building a sense of the whole from the accumulation of each individual encounter with the material. He was building that accumulation on the morning of July 8th, 1947. He was adding to it with each piece he handled, each attempt to fold or press or bend, each observation of a surface that held no mark of what had been done to it. The category he was forming, this material is unlike what I know, was developing piece by piece across the debris field of the northern pasture of the Foster Ranch, under a sky that was widening and brightening and offering no explanation of its own. The beam-like pieces were scattered among the foil fragments, not clustered separately. They lay where they had landed, oriented in various directions, their pale, smooth surfaces catching the light differently than the foil, a more matte quality, less reflective, giving them the appearance at a distance of small pieces of wood or lightweight structural material left across the ground. Up close, the texture was different from wood, smooth, not grained. The surface of a beam-like piece, examined at close range and in good light, showed no wood grain, no variation in surface texture that would suggest a fibrous internal structure. None of the qualities that made balsa wood. Balsa wood. It looked something like balsa in the way that it was pale and lightweight and rectangular. It did not behave like it. Marcel pressed his thumbs into the surface of one piece, the way you would test the softness of a piece of balsa or light pine, applying gentle pressure to feel the give. There was no give. The surface did not compress. The material did not take the impression of his thumbs. He increased the pressure. The result did not change. He set the piece down and looked at it, and then picked up another. Jesse Marcel Jr., decades later, described the markings on the inner surfaces of these beam pieces with a careful specificity that suggested a genuine attempt at accuracy rather than the embellishment that tends to accumulate in long-held stories. He was particular about what he said they were not. He said they were not letters. He was precise about this. He said they were not numbers in any numeral system he recognized. He said they were not pictographic in the sense of representing objects or figures. What he described, consistently, across the many occasions he was asked to describe it, was a geometric quality, a pattern of shapes arranged along the inner face of the beam, in a way that suggested organization, without resolving into any symbol system he could name. He described their color as purplish or pinkish. He described the way the light needed to fall at a particular angle before the markings became fully visible, and the way they seemed to recede slightly from the surface, rather than being printed or stamped or engraved onto it. He turned the beam in the kitchen light in Roswell on the night of July 7th, 1947, and he turned its memory in the light of his later years, and what he described was the same in both instances. The field continued to give up its contents as Marcel worked across it. The dark rubbery material appeared in several places, strips of something with the quality and weight of thick rubber or a dense monofilament, but dark, almost black, without the gloss that rubber tends to carry, and without the flexibility that might be expected from a material of its apparent texture. Witnesses described it as stiff, not brittle. It did not crack or break with handling, but resistant to deformation in the way that the foil was resistant, holding its form against pressure and returning to it, the material not inclined to yield in any direction. Marcel noted it. It became part of the inventory he was building across the morning. Foil, beams, dark rubbery strips, and the pale caliche earth beneath all of it, and the sky above, and the silence of the Foster Ranch pasture in July. There is something in the simple physicality of those hours that the accounts return to, not because the accounts are sentimental, but because the physical dimension of the debris field is the ground on which everything else in this case rests. The material was real. It was present on the ground of the northern pasture of the Foster Ranch. People picked it up. They held it in their hands. They turned it over and pressed it flat and tried to cut it and tried to burn it. What it did and did not do under those actions is what those people reported, separately, over a period of 50 years and more. Whatever the material was, whatever account eventually proves accurate, if one does, that morning on the Foster Ranch pasture is where the record begins. Marcel on the ground in the early light with the first piece of foil in his hands. The gouge in the earth at the northern end of the field was still visible in the morning light of July 8th. It had been there long enough, since late June or the first days of July, by the accounts of when the material first appeared, that the edges were not fresh, but had settled slightly, the exposed caliche dried to the same pale color as the surrounding surface. The furrow was not deep, an inch, perhaps two, at its deepest point, tapering to shallower at both ends, running in a line that aligned with the northwest to southeast orientation of the debris distribution spread to the south and east of it. Marcel examined it and noted it. It was part of the physical record of the pasture as he found it that morning, and it entered his accounts alongside everything else: the foil, the beams, the dimensions of the field, the behavior of the material under his hands. The morning was quiet. The debris lay across the pale desert ground in both directions, small and scattered, and distributed across an area too wide to take in at once, so that moving through the field meant moving from piece to piece with the rest of the field, always in peripheral vision, always present, but not fully held. Marcel worked through it steadily. The sky was wide and blue. The scrub grass was still and pale in the summer heat that was building as the morning advanced. The material lay where it had lain since it arrived in the pasture, unchanged, undamaged, returning to smooth, whenever a hand pressed it flat, holding its form against whatever was applied to it, giving nothing away about what it was or where it had come from. The whole field lay quiet in the early morning light, small pieces scattered across the pale caliche surface in every direction from where Marcel stood, the distribution running away from him to the northwest and the southeast both, the shallow gouge at the northern end of the field, faintly visible where the earth had received its mark, the foil fragments catching the light at angles that the scrub grass and the pale soil did not, the beam-like pieces lying pale and still, the whole spread of it simply resting there in the open air of the high desert plateau of Lincoln County, New Mexico, under a sky that offered nothing back, open and wide and still in the particular way that a large place is still when no one in it knows what they are looking at. The Chaves County Sheriff's Office sat on the main floor of a brick building on South Main Street in Roswell, New Mexico. In early July of 1947, it was a quiet room, a front desk, a few chairs, a telephone, the summer heat pressing against the windows from outside. Mac Brazel had come in from the north, from the long unpaved roads that led back toward the Foster Ranch and Lincoln County, and he had brought pieces of something with him. They rested on the desk in front of Sheriff George Wilcox now. Small pieces, lightweight, nothing that announced itself immediately as significant. Wilcox was a practical man in a practical office. He looked at what Brazel had brought and understood, without needing to deliberate, that this was not a matter for a county sheriff. The material was not from a car accident or a fire or anything else that belonged to his jurisdiction, in a recognizable way. He reached for the telephone. The number he dialed connected him to Roswell Army Airfield, about 8 miles north of the city, home of the 509th Bomb Group, which was at that moment the only unit in the world equipped and trained to carry atomic weapons. The duty officer at the base received the call. What happened in the minutes and hours after that call moved very quickly. Word reached the office of Colonel William Blanchard, commanding officer of the 509th Bomb Group. Blanchard made a decision that would generate the central events of the following 36 hours. He dispatched his intelligence officer, Major Jesse Marcel, to investigate what had been found. Marcel was a thorough officer with extensive experience in military aviation and aircraft recovery. If something had come down on a ranch in Lincoln County and scattered material across a pasture, Marcel was the person Blanchard trusted to assess what it was. He would also be accompanied by Captain Sheridan Cavett of the Counterintelligence Corps, a detail that reflected something about how the matter was being categorized at the base, even before anyone from the military had visited the site. The drive from Roswell Army Airfield to the Foster Ranch covered roughly 75 miles, much of it on unpaved ranch roads that wound north through open desert country. Marcel and Cavett made that drive on the evening of July 7th, 1947. The sun would have been low or already set by the time they left the base, and the roads north of Roswell grew darker and less traveled as the distance from the city increased. The headlights of their vehicle moved through the desert in a long, uninterrupted arc, the rangeland flat on either side, the sky above the high plateau, very wide and very dark. They arrived at the Brazel Ranch and spent the night there. The following morning, July 8th, 1947, they made their way out to the northern pasture. What Marcel encountered in that field and what he made of it would remain with him for the rest of his life. He would speak about it only decades later. On that morning in early July, he walked the debris scatter and handled what he found there, and what he found did not fit any category he could apply to it from his professional experience. The field would be examined more thoroughly in the hours that followed. A larger operation was being organized. Back in Roswell, the machinery of the military was moving at a pace that was not typical of routine balloon or aircraft recoveries. The 509th Bomb Group was an unusual unit. It had been formed specifically for the atomic mission, and it retained a culture of operational security that went well beyond what most military installations maintained. The fact that Blanchard had sent both his intelligence officer and a counterintelligence corps officer to the site in the same vehicle on the evening of Brazel's report suggested that the incident was being handled with a seriousness that a weather balloon would not ordinarily command. Within hours of Marcel's initial assessment of the debris field, additional personnel and vehicles were being organized at the base. The retrieval operation that followed involved soldiers and equipment transported from RAAF out to the Foster Ranch and to the scatter field in the northern pasture. The specific details of what was collected, how many vehicles were used, and exactly how long the operation took are not fully documented in surviving records. What is documented comes largely from civilian witnesses who were in the area during those days. Several individuals reported seeing military vehicles on the ranch roads north of Roswell, roads that were ordinarily used only by ranchers and were not near any main highway. Some reported being turned away from the area by soldiers positioned at points along the access roads, told that there was nothing to see and that they should continue on their way. The land around the Foster Ranch in that direction stretched flat and open for many miles, and a military presence on those roads would have been visible and notable to anyone driving through the area. What was recovered from the pasture was loaded into vehicles and transported back to Roswell Army Airfield. The material that had been sitting in a shed on the Foster Ranch property, the fragments Brazel had gathered and stored before driving to Roswell to report what he had found, was now in military custody, and the base received it. Whatever had been spread across 3/4 of a mile of open sheep pasture north of Roswell, in a scatter field several hundred feet wide, was now at the 509th Bomb Group's installation, behind the fence line of one of the most security-conscious military facilities in the United States. Colonel Blanchard, having authorized and overseen the initial retrieval operation, now made a second decision, one that would prove far more consequential in terms of the public record than anything that had happened on the ranch. He called in Lieutenant Walter Haut, the base's public information officer, and directed him to prepare a press release. The press release, issued on the authority of Blanchard himself and distributed to news outlets in Roswell and to national wire services on the morning of July 8, 1947, announced that the 509th Bomb Group had recovered a flying disc from a ranch in the Roswell region and that the material had been delivered to higher headquarters. The words flying disc had a specific resonance in the summer of 1947. Pilot Kenneth Arnold had reported seeing a formation of unusual high-speed objects near Mount Rainier in Washington state only 2 weeks earlier, on June 24th, and his account had generated widespread newspaper coverage and public discussion. The term flying saucer had emerged from that coverage and was widely in circulation when the 509th Bomb Group's public information officer issued a release using the term flying disc, a phrase in the same lexical neighborhood. It landed on wire service editors with immediate force. The release moved through the Associated Press and other services within the hour. Radio stations in Roswell broadcast it. Newspapers across the country placed it on front pages. The story was in print in cities across the United States and in international outlets before the afternoon was over. Lieutenant Walter Haut, who issued that release and whose name appeared on it, would later reflect on what he had done that morning. In a signed affidavit prepared before his death in 2005 and released posthumously, he described the events of those days in terms that went considerably beyond the weather balloon explanation that arrived later the same afternoon. But on the morning of July 8th, what Walter Haut knew was what Colonel Blanchard had authorized him to say, and what he said, transmitted by wire to newsrooms across the country, was that a flying disc had been recovered. The response to the press release was immediate and large. Reporters telephoned the base. News agencies requested additional information. The story had the quality of something that moved under its own momentum once it had been released into the wire service system, duplicating itself in telegraph transmissions and radio broadcasts faster than any single institution could monitor or manage. By midday on July 8th, Roswell Army Airfield had become, briefly, the most discussed military installation in the country. The call that changed the trajectory of those events came from above the level of the base. Brigadier General Roger Ramey, commanding officer of the 8th Air Force, operated from Fort Worth Army Airfield in Texas. He was several steps above Colonel Blanchard in the chain of command, and what was happening at Roswell, both the recovery operation and the press release that had been issued on Blanchard's authority, was now his to manage. Ramey called Blanchard back. The material was to be flown to Fort Worth. Marcel would accompany it. Jesse Marcel flew the recovered material to Fort Worth Army Airfield on July 8, 1947. He sat with it in Ramey's office while the general examined it. Then, at some point during the afternoon, Marcel was photographed in that office, alongside what appeared to be the debris from the Foster Ranch, photographs that show Marcel crouching beside a tangle of what appears to be standard foil-covered radar reflector material and balsa framework, the sort of assembly used in weather balloon tracking arrays. Those photographs were taken and distributed to the press as visual confirmation of what the material actually was. Within a short time of those photographs being taken, Marcel left the office. The material displayed in the photographs has been the subject of persistent dispute in the decades since. General Ramey held a press conference at Fort Worth Army Airfield on the afternoon of July 8, 1947. He stood before reporters and press photographers and stated clearly that the recovered material was a weather balloon with an attached radar reflector, a raw-and-target device, the kind used routinely by weather stations across the country to track upper atmosphere balloon trajectories. The material on his office floor, photographed extensively that afternoon, matched that description visually. Ramey was composed and specific. He had an explanation, and he offered it with the authority of a brigadier general commanding one of the Army Air Force's major operational units. Warrant Officer Irving Newton, a weather officer at Fort Worth Army Airfield, was brought to Ramey's office that afternoon and asked to examine the material on the floor and confirm its identity. Newton did so. He stated it was a standard raw in target, a foil and balsa radar reflector of exactly the kind he worked with regularly. His confirmation was on the record before the press conference ended. The official account was now supported by two named officers with relevant professional expertise, and the visual record appeared to corroborate what they were saying. The photographs were taken. The press conference concluded. The wire services received the corrected story. The speed of the reversal was striking in its precision. The morning press release had generated a story. The afternoon press conference with photographs generated a replacement story. Both traveled through the same wire service infrastructure on the same day, within hours of each other. By the evening of July 8, 1947, the national and international coverage was consolidating around the weather balloon explanation. Editors who had run the flying disc story in afternoon editions were already receiving the corrected version for their evening runs. The news cycle of 1947 moved through telegraph lines and radio broadcasts, and on that particular Tuesday, the same channels that had carried one version of events were now carrying another. Colonel Thomas Dubose served as Chief of Staff to General Ramey at Fort Worth in July 1947. He was present in Ramey's office during those hours. He appears in some of the photographs taken that afternoon, standing near the material on the floor, while Ramey and others were also present. Dubose's presence in those photographs was the kind of thing that in 1947 generated no particular comment. He was an officer doing his job in his commanding general's office. 40 years later, in the late 1980s and early 1990s, Dubose gave videotaped testimony to Roswell researchers. He was elderly by that point, and he spoke carefully and specifically about what he recalled from that afternoon. His account differed in a significant way from the official record. Dubose stated that he had received a telephone call from General Clement McMullen at Strategic Air Command headquarters before the press conference, that McMullen had directed him, through Ramey, to provide a cover story to the press. Dubose stated further that the material displayed on Ramey's office floor during the photography session was not the material that had arrived from Roswell, that the actual debris from the Brazel Ranch had already been packaged and shipped to higher headquarters before the press conference took place. What the photographers documented, according to Dubose's account, was a substitution. Dubose gave this account consistently across multiple interviews. The videotapes on which those interviews were recorded still exist and are held in research collections. It is worth sitting with what the documentary record shows and does not show at this point. What is documented? The press release of July 8th, issued under Blanchard's authority. What is documented? The press conference held by Rami on the afternoon of the same day. What is documented? The photographs taken in Rami's office, which are physically preserved and have been examined by researchers many times. What is documented? DuBose's videotaped testimony, in which he described the call from McMullen and the substitution of material. What is not established? Which account of what appeared on Rami's office floor is accurate? The photographs exist. The testimony exists. They have not been reconciled by any investigation with access to the original material. Mac Brazel, in the meantime, had been at Roswell Army Airfield since arriving in Roswell to report his find. The length of his stay at the base and the nature of his time there are described differently across different accounts. What is documented is that he remained in the area for several days following his initial report. On July 9, 1947, the day after Rami's press conference, the Roswell Daily Record published an interview with Brazel in which he described the debris he had found in terms that closely matched the official weather balloon explanation. He described rubber strips, tinfoil, paper, and sticks. The description was significantly different from what he had told the Proctors before driving to Roswell, and from the accounts that others who had seen his samples described before the military became involved. Brazel's July 9th account aligned neatly with what Rami had said the previous afternoon. People who knew Brazel and spoke with him in the period following his time at the base reported that he seemed different, quieter than usual, reluctant to discuss what he had found or what had happened in the days since. On at least one occasion, according to accounts from neighbors and acquaintances, he said that he wished he had never gone into Roswell to report the material at all. The man who had ridden out into a northern pasture in early July and crouched down to examine strange fragments in the pale rangeland now declined to revisit that morning when asked. The Roswell Daily Record interview of July 9th contains his words. Those words have been in print since that morning. By the evening of July 8, 1947, the photographs from Ramey's office at Fort Worth were already moving through the wire services. They showed a weather balloon's radar reflector laid out on an office floor, an intelligence officer nearby, a general who had provided a clear and official account of what the material was. For most of the country, the story had lasted one day. It had arrived in the morning editions with the word disk attached to it, and had departed in the evening editions as a weather balloon, which was a more familiar and less interesting thing. The story closed quickly. The next day's papers moved on to other subjects. The physical photographs from that afternoon are still held in archives. Several of them show Jesse Marcel with the material on the floor. One of them shows General Ramey standing with Colonel DuBose, both of them near the foil and balsa assembly. In a later examination of one photograph, researchers noted that Rami appears to be holding a folded document, a piece of paper, in his hand, and attempts were made to enhance and read the text of that document. The enhanced images produced fragmentary text that researchers have interpreted in different ways, none of them conclusively. The photograph still exists. The paper Rami holds in it still exists, or did exist at the time the photograph was taken. What was written on it has not been established. The 509th Bomb Group continued its operations at Roswell Army Airfield following those events. The base went back to its regular rhythm of flights and duties, and the administrative life of a large military installation. Colonel Blanchard, who had authorized the press release that started everything, continued his command and went on to a distinguished career. He eventually reached the rank of 4-star general. Lieutenant Holt, who had typed and distributed the release, remained at the base in his public information role. Major Marcel continued in his intelligence position. The men who had been part of those days of early July 1947 dispersed back into the normal course of military life. The press moved on with characteristic speed. In the last days of July 1947, another story, the crash of a transport aircraft in the San Gabriel Mountains near Burbank, California, occupied more of the wire services than anything connected to Roswell. The summer of 1947 was a busy one for news. The flying disc story from Roswell, corrected and explained within 24 hours by a general officer at Fort Worth, occupied less than a day's cycle in the national record. In the major newspapers of the period, it is findable but not prominent. It arrived, it was revised, and the news moved forward. Sheriff Wilcox, whose telephone call to the base on the first day had set the sequence in motion, gave no further public comment on the matter. His wife Inez, in accounts given years later, described military personnel visiting the sheriff's office in the days following his initial report, and speaking to Wilcox in terms she characterized as a warning, an instruction not to discuss what had been reported to him. Wilcox did not discuss it. He served out his time as sheriff and did not return to the subject in any documented public statement. The nature of the conversation Inez described, and what exactly was said, is known only through her account. The wire service photographs of Rame's office from the afternoon of July 8th continued to circulate in archive holdings long after the day itself had passed. They have been reproduced in books, in documentary films, in research papers, and in news coverage of the incident's various anniversaries. The foil and balsa material on the general's office floor, lit by whatever light was available in that room on a summer afternoon in Fort Worth, was the image that replaced the press release in the public record. It was a flat, specific visual answer to the question that had been raised that morning. For the wire services, for the newspaper editors, for the country's briefly interested attention, the image was sufficient. The photograph did the work that press conferences are designed to do. What the photograph could not address was the question of what had been on that floor before the photographers arrived. Whether the material shown was what Marcel had brought from Roswell, or whether, as Dubose described in testimony given 40 years later, it had been placed there as a substitution after the original debris was packaged and forwarded to higher headquarters. The photograph itself could not settle. The image captures what was photographed. It does not record what preceded the photography session or what happened to the other material afterward. Dubose's account, given consistently and preserved on videotape, remains in the record alongside the photographs, and the two have not been reconciled. By the close of July 8, 1947, the sequence of events that had begun with Mac Brazel's arrival in Sheriff Wilcox's office had moved through a military investigation, a retrieval operation, a press release, a corrective press conference, a set of widely distributed photographs, and a replacement news cycle, all within a period of roughly 36 hours. The speed was notable. The precision was notable. A story had entered the public record and been replaced, and the replacement had arrived with photographs. The night of July 8th settled over Fort Worth, over Roswell, over the Foster Ranch in Lincoln County, where the pasture now sat empty, the scatter field having been cleared. In the Roswell Daily Record's offices, the July 9th edition was being prepared. It would carry Brazel's interview, his description of rubber and foil and sticks. It would carry other local news beside it, ranch reports, weather, the ordinary texture of a small city's summer paper. The edition would be printed before dawn and distributed through the morning. Brazel's words would be in print before most residents of Roswell had their first cup of coffee. The photographs from Rami's office were already in newspaper archives and wire service collections across the country by the time that morning arrived. The foil and balsa material lay across the general's office floor in those images, preserved in the silver halide of mid-century press photography. The material flat and recognizable, the officers standing nearby in their summer uniforms, the Fort Worth office with its particular light. That image traveled outward along the telegraph lines and had already arrived in its final destinations by the time the evening of July 8th was over. It was in print, it was in the record, and the record as it stood at the close of that day said weather balloon in the newspaper archives of the United States, in the bound volumes of July 1947, issues held in libraries and research collections across the country. The photographs sit in the pages where they were first printed. They have been there since the summer of 1947. The caption beneath them, in whatever newspaper they appeared in, whatever city their wire service reached, said something about a weather balloon and a radar reflector and a general at Fort Worth who had identified the material. The caption had been accurate to the official account as it stood on the afternoon of July 8th. The official account had replaced the press release from that morning, and both the press release and the replacement were in the public record, available to anyone who looked, one following the other, on the same day, in the same summer, each printed in ink that had long since dried into the page. The photograph appeared in newspapers across the country on the morning of July 9th, 1947. In it, General Roger Ramey stands in his office at Fort Worth Army Airfield, and on the floor in front of him lies a spread of foil and balsa material, crinkled, familiar looking, the kind of thing a weather service might send aloft attached to a balloon. Colonel Thomas Dubose stands nearby. A press photographer crouches to frame the shot. The image was transmitted across telegraph wire lines within hours of being taken, and by the time most Americans sat down with their morning papers, they were looking at it. The caption told them what it was. The story, as far as the press was concerned, was over. That photograph and its caption became the first entry in a long official record, a record that would be revised, expanded, and supplemented across the following 5 decades, each revision generating its own documents, its own press releases, its own printed pages in government archives. The 1947 weather balloon explanation was not the last word on the Roswell incident. It was the opening line of a much longer document, one that is still held in federal repositories and accessible to anyone who requests it, the words unchanged from when they were first set down. What that record contains, read in sequence, is the history of how an official account changes across time. The changes are themselves part of the documented story of what happened in Lincoln County, New Mexico, in the summer of 1947. Each new document added something to the record. Each edition raised questions the previous document had not addressed. The record does not resolve into a single clean explanation. It continues, and it is honest in that continuation, in the way that long official records sometimes are. The 1947 press statement issued by the Army Air Force was brief and direct. The material recovered near Roswell, it said, was the remains of a weather observation balloon, the kind used routinely by the Army Air Force and the Army Air Corps for atmospheric monitoring at high altitudes. Attached to the balloon had been a radar reflector used to track the balloon's position and altitude from the ground. The photographs taken in General Ramey's office were offered as confirmation, visual evidence that the material in question was nothing more or less than what any trained observer would recognize as standard military meteorological equipment. The statement was accepted without significant challenge at the time. Newspaper editors across the country pulled the flying disc stories from their front pages and replaced them with the balloon correction. Wire services updated their dispatches. Radio stations aired the revised account. The 509th Bomb Group's initial announcement that a flying disc had been recovered from a ranch in the Roswell region receded quickly, treated as an embarrassing overclaim from an overeager public information officer in a remote New Mexico base. Within 48 hours, the incident had effectively ceased to be news. It remained not news for nearly 30 years. The official record sat undisturbed, its single 1947 entry unopened. The photographs of General Ramey's office floor available in newspaper archives, but rarely consulted. The event that had briefly occupied the front pages of papers from Albuquerque to London settled into the category of solved matters, a mistaken identification corrected promptly, an episode whose resolution had been documented and distributed and accepted. The filing drawer closed. The case, as far as the public record was concerned, was not open. Then, in the late 1970s, researchers began requesting documents. They spoke to veterans. They found Jesse Marcel Sr. They recorded interviews. And the questions that had been lying quiet in the official record for 3 decades came back into circulation with enough weight behind them that by the early 1990s, the government found it necessary to respond in writing. What that response looked like and what came after it constitutes the rest of the official documentary record, a record whose entries now span more than 50 years and whose final printed finding, issued in 1995, raises a question that the record itself does not answer. The first formal written revision of the 1947 weather balloon explanation arrived in September 1994, nearly half a century after the original statement had been issued. The Air Force released a report titled The Roswell Report, Fact versus Fiction in the New Mexico Desert, a printed government document running to several hundred pages, carrying the official seal of the Department of the Air Force on its cover, available through the government printing office to any member of the public who ordered a copy. The report offered a new explanation for what the Roswell Ranch debris had been, and that explanation was specific, documented, and grounded in a real classified program that had operated out of the American Southwest in the late 1940s. The program was called Project Mogul. It had been classified since its inception, which explained, the report argued, why the 1947 explanation had been vague. Project Mogul was a program designed to monitor Soviet nuclear tests from a distance. The monitoring method involved long trains of balloons, many balloons strung together in a single assembly that could reach considerable length, carrying acoustic sensors capable of detecting the low-frequency sounds produced by a nuclear detonation at high altitude. The balloon trains were released over the New Mexico desert and floated northeast on the prevailing upper-level winds, their sensors recording whatever the atmosphere carried to them. The program was run in part out of Alamogordo Army Airfield, roughly 100 miles southwest of the Foster Ranch. The report argued that one of these Mogul balloon trains, flight number 4, had been released in early June 1947 and had subsequently been lost, its tracking signal gone, its recovery not recorded, the debris found in Mac Brazel's northern pasture. The 1994 report proposed was the remains of that balloon train scattered across a large area of open rangeland after the assembly had come apart at altitude and its components had descended across the terrain below. The unusual foil material, the report suggested, had come from the radar reflectors attached at intervals along the train, reflectors manufactured not by a government contractor, but by a New York toy company called Toy Manufacturers, Inc., which produced the reflectors from a foil and balsa construction that bore printed geometric designs in a purplish ink along its inner surfaces. The printed geometric designs were significant. They accounted, the report proposed, for the witness descriptions of hieroglyphic or symbolic markings on the inner surfaces of the beam-like debris components. The foil radar reflectors had been stamped with these designs as part of their commercial manufacture, and the ink and material used were properties of the specific production run. The report included photographs of the reflector material and the printed designs. The designs were visible, angular, repetitive, not identical to the markings witnesses had described, but bearing a structural resemblance that the report offered as explanatory. The 1994 document sat on shelves in libraries and Air Force offices and research archives, its cover facing outward, its several hundred pages available for examination. Researchers read it carefully. Some found the Project Mogul identification persuasive. Others noted points where the account did not align with specific witness descriptions of the material's physical properties. The debate that followed was conducted primarily in research publications and documentary interviews, not in government offices. The official record had been updated. The 1994 document was now the current entry, but the drawer had not been closed again, and it would be opened once more before 3 years had passed. In June 1997, the 50th anniversary of the Roswell incident was observed across New Mexico with considerable public attention. Conferences were held, researchers gathered, museums staged exhibitions. The city of Roswell, which had quietly incorporated the event into its identity over the preceding decade, marked the occasion with a week of events attended by tens of thousands of visitors. Into this environment, the Air Force released a second report, the Roswell Report, Case Closed, its title suggesting a finality that the document's contents somewhat complicated. The 1997 report did not revisit the material debris. It addressed something different. It addressed the witnesses who had described, at various points in the intervening decades, the recovery of bodies, humanoid figures found in or near the debris field, small and pale and unmoving, unlike any human form the witnesses could account for. These accounts had accumulated in the research literature across the 1980s and 1990s, drawn from named and unnamed sources, varying in their specific details, but sharing certain consistent features. The Air Force's 1997 report proposed an explanation for them. The explanation centered on a program called Project High Dive and a related program called Project Excelsior. These were high-altitude human subject parachute test programs conducted over the New Mexico desert, programs designed to develop techniques for emergency egress from aircraft operating at extreme altitudes. The tests involved dropping anthropomorphic dummies, human-shaped figures dressed in flight suits, and instrumentation harnesses from balloons at altitudes above 90,000 feet, then recovering the dummies and their instrument packages from the desert surface after descent. The dummies were roughly human in proportion, though their physical features were simplified, their faces flat and featureless, their limbs jointed only approximately. The 1997 report proposed that witnesses who had described small humanoid bodies recovered from the Roswell area had, decades later, misremembered or conflated their recollections with observations of these test dummies. The report included photographs of the dummies, figures arranged on their backs in desert terrain, figures being lowered from aircraft, figures lying in military transport vehicles with personnel standing around them. The photographs were meant to demonstrate a visual resemblance to what witnesses had described. The dates of the High Dive and Excelsior test drops were documented, The earliest of them had been conducted in 1954. The latest had extended into 1959. The 1947 incident had occurred 7 years before the earliest documented test drop, in some cases 12 years before the specific tests the report cited. The report acknowledged the gap in dates. It suggested that human memory, across decades, could conflate events separated by years, particularly events that shared visual and situational similarities. The witnesses had seen the dummies. The witnesses had also known or learned of the 1947 incident. In the long interval between the events and the interviews, the report proposed the two sets of memories had merged. Researchers noted the date gap at length. The 1997 report's explanation required accepting that witnesses had imported memories from events that occurred nearly a decade after 1947 into their recollections of the summer of 1947, and had done so consistently enough to describe humanoid figures in a debris recovery context with the specific details they provided. The response to this observation within the official record was silence. The report had been issued, the explanation offered, and no supplementary document came after it to address the chronological problem. The 1997 report remained the Air Force's final formal statement on the subject. The case closed, entry stayed in the file. The file remained open to public examination. Running alongside the Air Force's own documentary activity in the 1990s was a separate inquiry conducted through different channels. Stephen Schiff, a Republican congressman representing New Mexico's 1st Congressional District, began formally requesting records related to the 1947 incident in the early part of the decade. Schiff had heard from constituents who had questions about Roswell, and he had pursued those questions through what he later described as normal congressional inquiry, written requests to the Department of Defense and the Air Force asking for a complete accounting of whatever records pertained to the incident. The responses Schiff received from the Defense Department were, by his own public account, unsatisfactory. He described the department's handling of his requests as a runaround, a word he used in press statements, a word that entered the record of his public statements as a congressman from New Mexico. The documents he sought were not produced to him in any form he found responsive to his requests. The correspondence between his office and the Defense Department became its own small paper record, a set of letters and responses and follow-up requests that document an inquiry that did not produce the information it sought. Schiff's response to this impasse was to request a formal audit. He asked the Government Accountability Office, the independent, nonpartisan investigative arm of Congress, whose mandate includes examining federal record-keeping practices, to review the documentary record of the Roswell incident. The GAO agreed and conducted a review of files held at the National Archives, at Department of Defense repositories, and at Air Force records facilities. The review was methodical. It covered a defined period and a defined geographic scope. When the GAO issued its report in 1995, the document was placed in the public record and has remained there since. The 1995 GAO report covered considerable ground. It examined what records had survived, what records had been transferred, and what records could be located relating to activities at Roswell Army Airfield in 1947. Much of what the auditors looked for, they found, or found references to. Documents about the base's operational activities, correspondence between RLA-AIF and its higher headquarters, administrative records from the period. Many of these survived in the National Archives or in Air Force record repositories, available for examination by researchers who request access. But within the audit, one specific finding stood in the report without an accompanying explanation. Outgoing messages from Roswell Army Airfield covering the period from October 1946 through December 1949, a span of more than 3 years that encompassed the entire summer of 1947 and the months that followed, had been destroyed. The destruction had been carried out without authorization under the Federal Records Management Regulations, then in effect. Standard records management procedure required documentation of any destruction, a form indicating what was destroyed, when, on whose authority, and under what retention schedule. No such documentation existed for these messages. The GAO noted this finding in plain government prose. The outgoing messages were gone. The records of their destruction were gone. The audit could not determine who had authorized the disposal, when it had occurred, or what the destroyed messages had contained. The GAO's report included this finding in the same format as its other findings, a line or a paragraph in a government document, typed in standard official style, unadorned by interpretive comment. The finding did not carry an explanation, because no explanation was available to the auditors who had searched for one. The records had not been located. The required documentation of their destruction had not been located. The audit could proceed no further along that particular line of inquiry, and so it noted what it had found and moved to the next item. That 1995 finding, the specific sentence noting the unauthorized destruction of RAFS outgoing messages for the period of the incident, was not a dramatic document. It was a routine piece of government auditing language inserted into a report that covered many pages and many findings. It did not conclude anything beyond what the audit had established. It did not allege wrongdoing. It did not propose an explanation for the disposal. It simply noted, with the flat precision of government audit language, that records which should have existed did not, and that the documentation which would have explained their absence also did not exist. The report was placed in the public record. Copies were distributed to Schiff's office and to other offices with an interest in the findings. The document was deposited with the National Archives, where it has remained since 1995. Researchers who request it can read it today. The finding is on the page where it was set down nearly 3 decades ago. The words have not changed. What the sequence of official documents from 1947 to 1995 shows, read together as a body of record, is a pattern that official records sometimes describe when an event resists clean categorization, a pattern of revision and supplementation, each new document arriving in response to pressures the previous document had not quieted, each new document generating questions its predecessor had not raised. The 1947 weather balloon statement was complete in itself. Then it was supplemented by the 1994 Project Mogul report, which was complete in itself. Then the 1997 Case Closed report arrived to address dimensions the 1994 document had not touched, and running alongside all of it was the GAO audit, which arrived at findings none of the Air Force documents had anticipated, and none of them subsequently addressed. This is not in itself an unusual thing for a body of official records to look like. Government records on complex matters often carry this quality. Each document complete in its moment, each document superseded or complicated by what comes after. The whole record reading is something more contingent than any single entry suggests. What is slightly unusual here is the date gap across which the revisions occurred. Nearly 50 years between the first official statement and the first formal revision, and the revisions themselves spanning 7 years across 2 Air Force reports and 1 congressional audit. That is a long time for a single event to generate documents. The Mogul balloon train, identified in the 1994 report, Flight Number 4, released from Alamogordo in early June 1947, is itself a documented thing. Project Mogul was a real program. Its records survived classification and have been reviewed by researchers. The balloon trains were real, the acoustic sensors were real, the foil radar reflectors stamped with geometric designs were real, and the specific flight in question is recorded in project documentation as having been lost. The identification is not an invention, it is a documented hypothesis, grounded in real program materials and real flight records. What the debate within the research literature has focused on is not whether Project Mogul existed, but whether a lost Mogul flight adequately accounts for all of the specific physical descriptions provided by the people who handled the debris. Some researchers have concluded that it does, that the foil reflectors, their printed designs, and the other materials in a Mogul train assembly are sufficient to account for what was found. Others have focused on specific witness descriptions that they argue the Mogul identification does not accommodate: the self-returning shape of the foil, the resistance of the beam-like members to cutting and burning, and the scale of the debris field relative to what a single balloon train assembly would produce. That debate is part of the record too, though it lives in research publications and documentary archives rather than in government documents. The crash test dummy explanation from the 1997 report has generated a similar debate, focused primarily on the date gap already noted. The Air Force addressed the gap directly in the report, arguing for the possibility of memory conflation across decades. Researchers who reject the explanation argue that the gap is too large to be bridged by memory alone, that witnesses who described events in 1947 would not have been likely to incorporate observations from 1954 through 1959 into those recollections without awareness of the substitution. The disagreement remains, recorded in the literature, not resolved by any subsequent official document. What sits at the end of this long sequence of documents is not a resolution. It is the 1995 GAO finding, the audit page with its notation of destroyed records, placed in the National Archives and available to any researcher who walks in and requests the file. That finding does not answer anything. It simply establishes, in official language, that a particular set of records from a particular period is no longer available for examination. The period it covers is the period of the 1947 incident. The records it describes are the outgoing communications of the base, most directly involved in the incident's public history. Their absence from the archive is established. The reason for their absence is not. There is a particular quality to official documents that notes something without explaining it. The language is careful and bounded. Here is what we found. Here is what we did not find. Here is the limit of what the audit could establish. The document does not speculate beyond that limit. It does not offer a theory about what the missing records might have contained. It notes the gap and stops at the edge of the gap because that is where the evidence ends. That quality, which is a feature of honest auditing, is also what makes the 1995 finding feel heavier than the pages around it. It is not asking for anything. It is simply there. The full official record of the Roswell incident, the 1947 press statement, the 1994 Mogul report, the 1997 Case Closed report, the GAO audit, the various congressional correspondence and research requests that surrounded them, occupies a considerable amount of paper across several archives. Much of it is entirely mundane, in the way that government records are mundane. Much of it is the kind of institutional documentation that accumulates around any event that generates sufficient official and public attention over a long enough period: administrative correspondence, press releases, report covers and appendices, and reference lists. The pages of a bureaucracy working through something that has been asked of it, producing documents in response, filing them, depositing them with the appropriate authorities. Somewhere within that accumulation is the 1947 photograph of General Ramey's office floor, the foil and balsa spread across the carpet, the press lights casting a flat light across it, Ramey and Dubose standing at the edge of the frame. That photograph is part of the record, too, held in newspaper archives and research collections, reproduced in books and documentaries and online archives. It is a real photograph of real material in a real room on the afternoon of July 8th, 1947. What the photograph shows is, in the strict sense, exactly what it shows. Material on a floor, two officers nearby, a room in a military installation in Fort Worth. What the material was, and whether it was the material recovered from the Foster Ranch, is a question the photograph does not answer. It only shows what the camera recorded. Thomas Dubose, who stands in the photograph, gave videotaped interviews in the late 1980s and early 1990s. He was asked about the photograph. He identified the material in it as a substitution, not the actual Brazel Ranch debris, which he stated had already been packaged and shipped to higher headquarters before the press conference, but a piece of radar reflector material brought in for the press photographers. Dubose was a general officer at the time of the incident, and a credible witness by any standard applied to military testimony. His account is part of the research record. The photograph is part of the official photographic record. They describe different things. The official record does not contain Dubose's videotaped testimony. That testimony lives in the archives of private researchers, tapes recorded in domestic settings, transferred eventually to research collections, cataloged and held for access by people studying the case. Official records and research records are different repositories. Each contains things the other does not. The full record of the Roswell incident, held across both kinds of archives, is larger and more various than any single document within it suggests. What the official record alone contains, the government documents, from 1947 to 1995, is this: a weather balloon explanation issued on July 8, 1947, a Project Mogul identification issued in September 1994, a crash test dummy explanation issued in June 1997, and a GAO audit finding issued in 1995, noting that the outgoing messages from Roswell Army Airfield during the period of the incident were destroyed without proper authorization, and that no documentation of that destruction survives to explain who authorized it or when it occurred. That last sentence is the final sentence in the official record as it currently stands. The pages of the GAO report that contain it are in the National Archives in Washington. The report's catalog number is available through the GAO's public records system. A researcher who goes to the reading room and requests the relevant document will be handed the folder. The folder will contain the report. The report will contain the finding. The words will be there, unchanged, typed in the standard government document format that official findings have been printed in for decades. The words note an absence. They do not explain it. They sit in the archive alongside all the other pages of the official record. The 1947 press statement, the 1994 report, the 1997 report, the congressional correspondence, each document filed in its place, each one part of a long record of revisions and additions that began on the afternoon of July 8th, 1947, when a press photographer crouched on the floor of an office in Fort Worth and framed the shot. The photograph traveled across the telegraph lines that evening. The papers carried it the following morning. The record that photograph opened has been added to several times since. The most recent addition, the one that sits at the end of the sequence, is the GAO's 1995 audit report, a government document available through standard public records request, held in the National Archives, a finding printed on a page in a folder in a reading room in Washington, the words sitting there quietly, unchanged, in the way that things in archives sit unchanged when no one has yet come to disturb them. The specific sentence that noted the unauthorized destruction of Roswell Army Airfield's outgoing messages for the period covering July 1947 has been in the public record since 1995. It has been read by researchers, cited in books, discussed in documentary films, reproduced in articles in academic and popular journals. None of that discussion has produced an explanation for the absence it describes. The records are gone. The documentation of their disposal is gone. The sentence noting these facts remains, and the archive around it continues to hold what it holds, and the question the sentence raises has not been formally answered by any subsequent document in any repository that has been located by the researchers who have spent decades looking. There is something particular about a long official record that arrives, after 50 years of additions, at a page that notes a gap rather than filling one. The 1947 statement was a filling. It provided an explanation, closed the question, let the news cycle move on. Dave, the 1994 report was a filling. It identified a program, named a balloon train, offered a documented alternative account. The 1997 report was a filling. It named a mechanism for memory conflation, provided photographs, proposed an explanation for the witness accounts it was addressing. Each filling produced the next question. And the GAO audit, which was itself a process of looking for things to fill with, arrived at something it could not fill. A period of records from a specific military installation during a specific span of time, no longer available for examination. The reason for their absence unrecorded. That is where the official record rests. The 1995 audit finding is in the National Archives. The words are still there. The folder that contains them is held in a reading room in Washington, available to anyone who goes to the desk and asks. Jesse Marcel Sr. sat across from a researcher in the late 1970s, his hands resting on the arms of the chair, a man in his 60s now, his military career long behind him. The room around him was ordinary, a domestic interior, low light, the quiet of a recording session just beginning. 30 years had passed since the morning he crouched in a New Mexico pasture and lifted a piece of thin, bright material from the pale ground. 30 years in which he had not spoken publicly about what he found there, what he handled, what he carried back in the dark on a July night, while his son watched from the kitchen floor. The tape recorder on the table between him and the researcher was turning. He began to speak. That distance, 3 decades between the moment and the room where it was finally described, is one of the most persistent qualities of the Roswell record. The people who were there in July 1947 did not, for the most part, rush to tell their stories. Some waited years, some waited most of their lives. And what is worth holding, quietly, about that fact, is not what it proves or does not prove, but simply what it means to carry something without speaking it, to go back to ordinary work, ordinary weeks, ordinary decades, while a particular morning in a pasture or an office or a mortuary in a small New Mexico city stays somewhere in the back of the mind, not quite accountable, not quite releasable. Marcel told the researcher that the debris he had handled at the Foster Ranch was unlike any material he had encountered in his military career. He was specific about this. He did not say it was strange in a general way. He said he had experience with aircraft wreckage, with balloon equipment, with radar reflectors, with a range of materials that a military intelligence officer working in 1947 would have been expected to recognize and classify. He said the thin foil-like material from the Brazel Ranch did not belong to any category available to him. He said it returned to its flat shape after being crumpled or folded. He said the lightweight beam-like members could not be broken or deformed by hand, despite resembling balsa wood in weight and dimension. He said he had never, before or after that morning, encountered anything that behaved the way those materials behaved. The tape recorded all of this. It was still recording when he finished. His son Jesse Marcel Jr. had been approximately 11 years old in July 1947 when his father arrived home late one night with a car full of material from the ranch. In the accounts Marcel Jr. gave throughout his adult life, accounts he maintained with consistency until his death in 2013, he described sitting on the kitchen floor of the family home in Roswell, handling pieces of the debris his father spread out to show him, studying the inner surfaces of the beam-like members in the kitchen light. He described geometric or hieroglyphic-like markings there, faint, in a purplish or pinkish hue. He described the foil that would not stay crumpled. He described the quiet of the house around him, his mother nearby, the late hour, the strangeness of being a child holding something he could not name. He gave that account in interviews across several decades, in signed affidavits, in a book published under his own name. The account did not change in its essential details. It remained the same description, from the same kitchen, from the same night. The consistency across time of what Jesse Marcel Sr. and Jesse Marcel Jr. reported is one of the features of their testimony that researchers have noted most often. Not because consistency establishes truth, it does not by itself, but because it places two named documentable individuals on the record across a span of decades, describing specific physical properties of specific objects they describe having held in their hands. The materials those objects were made from have not been conclusively identified. The testimony remains in the archive, specific and undisturbed, the way a clear detail in a long document sometimes survives every revision around it. Marcel Senior had gone 30 years without speaking publicly. What brought him forward in the late 1970s was contact from a researcher named Stanton Friedman, who had begun gathering accounts from individuals connected to the July 1947 events. Marcel spoke to Friedman and then to others, and what he said was this: he had never believed the weather balloon explanation. He had been shown weather balloons. He had been shown radar reflectors. He had worked with the materials those things were made from. What he had handled in the pasture north of Roswell was not made from those materials and did not behave the way those materials behaved. He said this carefully, without drama, in the recorded interviews that still exist. The recordings themselves are physical objects, tapes, then transcriptions, now digital files in research archives, and they have been there, available since they were made. General Thomas Dubose had a different kind of account to give. Dubose had served as Chief of Staff to General Roger Ramey at Fort Worth Army Airfield in July 1947. He had been present at the press conference at which Ramey displayed what was described to photographers and journalists as the recovered debris from the Brazel Ranch, foil and balsa material, spread across the floor of Ramey's office, the cameras recording it, the image going out on the wire services before the day was over. Dubose gave his account in videotaped interviews in the late 1980s and early 1990s. He was elderly by then, his military career decades behind him, and he spoke directly and without apparent hesitation to the camera recording him. What DuBose described was a telephone call. The call had come from General Clement McMullen at Strategic Air Command Headquarters, and it directed DuBose to provide a cover story to the press regarding the recovered material. DuBose stated in his recorded testimony that the material displayed at Ramey's press conference had already been substituted, that the actual debris from the Brazel Ranch had been packaged and shipped to higher headquarters before the photographers arrived, and that what the cameras recorded on the floor of Ramey's office was not what Marcel had brought from New Mexico. He was clear about this. He said it on camera, in his own voice, in footage that was preserved in research collections and remains accessible. DuBose died in 1992. The videotape of his testimony did not die with him. The footage of DuBose speaking is a particular kind of document. An elderly man in a domestic setting, addressing a camera, aware that he is being recorded, aware that the recording will outlast him, describing a telephone call he received in 1947 and what that call directed him to do. Whatever the content of what he describes, the footage itself is real. The testimony is preserved. It sits in its archive the way all these documents sit, unchanged, legible, available, holding the words of a man who was there, in the room, on that afternoon in Fort Worth, while the photographers crouched around the material on the floor and the shutters opened and closed. Glenn Dennis was working as a mortician for Ballard Funeral Home in Roswell in the first week of July, 1947. He was young then, in his early 20s, and he gave a documented account of a series of telephone calls he received from the mortuary officer at Roswell Army Airfield during the period immediately following Mac Brazel's report and the subsequent military retrieval operation. The calls, as Dennis described them in interviews given decades later, concerned the availability of small hermetically sealed caskets and the proper procedures for handling bodies that had been exposed to the elements without disturbing tissue in ways that would compromise forensic analysis. Dennis was specific about what the calls asked and what he understood them to imply. He named the institution whose officer called him. He described the content of the calls in detail. His account has been scrutinized extensively by researchers, and certain elements of it, particularly a claimed encounter with a nurse who described what she had witnessed at the base hospital, have not been independently verified and remain unconfirmed in the documented record. The casket inquiry calls, as Dennis described them, are his account alone, recorded in his interviews, available in the research literature, held with the same open and unresolved status as the rest of what the Roswell record contains. The calls either happened as Dennis described, or they did not. The documentation for what occurred inside Roswell Army Airfield during that week is incomplete for reasons the record also notes elsewhere, and the question of what the calls were about has not been settled. What Dennis said on the record is preserved. What it means remains, as of the date that anything in this case can be said to remain anything, open. There is no satisfaction available there, no clean resolution to take to sleep. There is only a young mortician at a telephone in a small city funeral home in the summer heat of a July afternoon in 1947, writing down what the voice on the other end of the line was asking about, uncertain what to make of it, uncertain enough that he remembered it for the rest of his life. William Woody was a teenager in the summer of 1947, living on a ranch south of the Foster Ranch in Lincoln County, New Mexico. He gave an account of an evening, in late June or early July, he believed, when he and his father were outside and witnessed something crossing the northern sky. Bright, fast-moving, luminous, accompanied by a sound he described as rushing, it traveled from their position northward and disappeared. When news of Brazel's discovery became public, and word spread through the ranching community that something had come down on the Foster property, Woody's father decided they should drive north to see what they could find. They drove north. The road narrowed as it went, and then it ended, not at a destination, but at a point where it was blocked. A military vehicle across the track, a soldier standing beside it, the land beyond the roadblock, continuing as it always had, flat and open and pale under the desert sky, except that now there were personnel on it who had not been there before. Woody and his father turned back. They drove south the way they had come, through the same ranch country, the same dry air, the same summer light, the Foster Ranch somewhere off to the north behind them, and whatever was on it, attended to by people who had arrived from elsewhere and were not inviting visitors. Woody reported this. He gave his account in interviews available in the research record, one more named individual with a specific memory of a specific moment in a specific place. The moment he described, standing at a roadblock in the New Mexico rangeland while a soldier indicated they would not be going further, is not the most dramatic detail in the Roswell case. It is not the strangest thing anyone reported. It is simply one quiet scene in a larger collection of scenes. A father and a teenage son turned back at a dirt road on a summer afternoon, and then the drive home through the desert, and then the years that came after, and then at some point later, the interview in which Woody described what he remembered, and the record that contains it still. There is something in the aggregate of these accounts, Marcel, Dubose, Dennis, Woody, that is worth sitting with, not as evidence arranged toward a conclusion, but as a human fact about what 1947 left behind. These are real people. They had names and careers and families, and decades of ordinary life on either side of the week they each described. They gave their accounts at different times, in different contexts, to different researchers, without obvious coordination. The accounts are not identical. They do not fit together into a single seamless story. What they share is a set of intersecting memories of the same period, in the same place, memories that each of these individuals lived with for years before putting them into the record, and that the record now holds in whatever form records hold things imperfectly, partially, but persistently. The Roswell Daily Record of July 9th, 1947 contains an interview with Mac Brazel. The newspaper is a physical object. It exists in archive holdings at the Roswell Public Library and has been accessible to researchers who request it since the paper was published. The ink is dry. The columns are set in the typography of a small regional paper of that era. Brazel's name appears in the headline. His words are quoted in the text of the article, and those words describe the debris in terms that differ noticeably from the descriptions he gave to the proctors before contacting authorities, and from the description Marcel provided of what he found at the ranch. In the record, Brazel described rubber strips, tinfoil, paper, sticks. The language is matter-of-fact, domestic in its plainness, material that any rancher in 1947 might expect to find after a balloon or instrument package came down on open rangeland. The article presents this account straightforwardly, without editorial comment. Brazel's name is printed. His words are quoted. The paper is dated and archived. The difficulty that researchers have consistently noted is that Brazel had spent several days at Roswell Army Airfield between finding the debris and giving that interview. Neighbors who spoke with him afterward described him as subdued, reluctant to discuss the matter, changed in some way they found difficult to name, from the man who had arrived in Roswell with samples in his truck and a straightforward rancher's question about what he had found on his land. He was heard on at least one occasion to say that he wished he had never reported the find at all. Whether what changed in Brazel during those days at the base was the result of instruction, pressure, persuasion, or simply the fatigue and disorientation of several days in an unfamiliar institutional environment, this is not something the record establishes. The record establishes that he was there, that he came out saying something different from what he had said going in, and that people who knew him noticed the difference. The July 9th newspaper account of his words is real. The words themselves are preserved. What produced them in their particular plainness is not something the documents available can fully account for. These are the materials the Roswell case has always rested on, not hardware in a hangar somewhere, not a definitive scientific analysis of recovered substance, not a classified file released under Freedom of Information law with a date stamp and a clear answer on the last page. What the case rests on is a collection of named human beings who described specific things they said they witnessed or handled or were told at a specific time in a specific place, and then lived for years with those descriptions inside them before putting them into the record where they have stayed. Jesse Marcel Sr., interviewed in the late 1970s, decades after the morning in the pasture. Thomas Dubose, filmed in the late 1980s, decades after the afternoon in Remé's office. Glenn Dennis, recorded in his descriptions of the calls he received at the funeral home. William Woody, describing the roadblock and the soldier and the drive home through the desert. Mac Brazel, quoted in a county newspaper the day after he came out of the base, his words in print and available, and not quite matching what he had said before. These are documents. They are imperfect, as all documents are imperfect. They are partial, as all human accounts of events are partial, shaped by what the speaker remembers and what they choose to include, and what time has done to the contours of a July week in 1947. They are held in archives and research collections, in the kind of careful files that people who have spent their careers on this case have kept over many years, and what they contain is not proof of any particular explanation, and it is not proof that no explanation exists. It is simply what remains. The question of what descended on or near the Foster Ranch in the summer of 1947, what scattered across the pale desert pasture in a field approximately 3/4 of a mile long, what Brazel found on his morning ride and gathered into his shed, what Marcel carried back through the New Mexico night and spread on a kitchen floor for his sleeping family. That question is still formally open. The Air Force released its reports. The GAO conducted its records audit. Researchers wrote their books and filed their affidavits and recorded their interviews and preserved their tapes and kept their files. The case has been examined from a great many angles by a great many people across more than 7 decades, and the answer to the central question, what was it, has not been established to the satisfaction of everyone who has looked at the evidence. That is simply the condition of this case. It is not the condition of a mystery in the sense of something awaiting its detective, its final scene, its resolution before the credits roll. It is the condition of something that happened in a place and a time that did not fully record itself, that involved institutions with reasons to control what became public, that depended on human memory and human honesty and human imperfection across decades of retelling, and that has arrived in the present in the form of a set of documents and testimonies that are genuinely inconsistent with each other in some respects, and genuinely consistent with each other in others, and that do not add up cleanly in either direction. The sheep pasture on the northern portion of the Foster Ranch is still there. The land has changed hands over the years. The caliche earth and the scrub grass and the wide flat sky have continued as they always have, seasons moving through the high desert plateau, the silence of that elevation unchanged by what occurred in its fields in one specific summer. The shallow furrow, if it was ever there, has long since been smoothed by weather and time. The fragments that were gathered and taken away are wherever they are, in whatever facility or archive or storage location holds them, or they are nowhere, dispersed or lost or reclassified, or simply gone in the way that physical things sometimes go. What remains on the land itself is the land. Mac Brazel worked the Foster Ranch through 1947 and the years that followed. His neighbors remembered him as quieter on the subject after that summer, the way some people become quieter on a subject when the subject has cost them something they did not expect. He had found something unusual in his pasture and done what a careful, practical man does: gathered a sample, showed it to neighbors, reported it to the authorities, and then the authorities had arrived, and more authorities behind them, and an intelligence officer had come out from the base, and vehicles had come out behind the intelligence officer, and then a press release had gone out, and then a press conference in Fort Worth had walked the press release back, and somewhere in the middle of all of that, Mac Brazel had spent several days at Roswell Army Airfield and come out saying something different from what he had said going in. He is not available to clarify. He died in 1963. What he said to Floyd and Loretta Proctor at their ranch house in late June or early July is what Loretta Proctor remembered and later described. What he said in the Roswell Daily Record on July 9th is what the newspaper printed and what the archive holds. What he said to the neighbors who found him subdued and reluctant in the weeks that followed is what those neighbors described in their own accounts. The full range of what Mac Brazel thought and felt and knew is not available. It went with him. What is left is the record, a fragmented, inconsistent, partial record, but a real one composed of real names and real dates and real documents that exist in real archives and can be requested and read and held in the hands of anyone who makes the trip to find them. The Roswell Daily Record of July 9th, 1947 is a piece of newsprint that has been sitting in a folder in the Roswell Public Library for more than 75 years. Someone printed it, and it was read, and then it was filed, and then the years moved around it, and it remained. The ink on the page is the same ink that was there in 1947, marking the same words in the same columns on the same paper, Brazel's name, his account of the debris, the particular plainness of the language. The testimony tapes are real. The filmed interviews are real. The GAO report is real. The press release that Lieutenant Halt sent to the wire services on July 8, 1947, is real and preserved. The photographs from Remy's press conference are real and have been studied by researchers for decades, including an analysis of a document Remy is shown holding in one image, the text of which has been the subject of considerable forensic attention over the years. These are all physical things. They were made by human hands, and they have persisted in the way that physical things persist when they are kept carefully and not destroyed. The outgoing messages from Roswell Army Airfield for the period covering the autumn of 1946 through the end of 1949, messages that would have been generated during July 1947 and its immediate aftermath, are not real in the sense that they are not available. The GAO's 1995 audit found that they had been destroyed without proper authorization under the federal records regulations that govern their preservation. The audit noted this. The GAO report containing that notation is itself still real and available, a document that has existed in the public record since 1995. The words describing the absence of the other documents are preserved. The documents themselves are gone. That particular absence, the space where the July 1947 outgoing messages from Roswell Army Airfield would have been, sits at the center of the Roswell case, the way certain silences sit at the center of certain conversations. Not explanatory, not accusatory, simply present, noting that something that should be there is not there, and that the reasons for its absence were not recorded in the same documents that noted the absence itself. The case has been called closed by those who find the Project Mogul explanation sufficient. It has been called open by those who find the witness testimonies and the records gaps insufficiently accounted for by that explanation. What it actually is, in the sense that can be honestly said, is unresolved, held in that condition not by any single dramatic failure of evidence, but by the accumulated weight of partial things, partial records, partial testimonies, partial explanations that account for some of the reported details and leave others without a satisfying account. The unresolved condition is not dramatic. It is simply the condition the case is in, 75 years on, with the people who were there in 1947 no longer available to be asked, and the documents that might have clarified matters either preserved in their imperfect form or absent in the way that the RAAF messages are absent, with no clear record of who decided they should go. Jesse Marcel Jr. died in 2013. He had been a physician, a military officer himself, a flight surgeon who served in Iraq, a husband, a father. He had spent the intervening decades describing when asked, the night his father came home late with the material from New Mexico and spread it on the kitchen floor for the family to see. The kitchen, the light, the markings on the inner surface of the beam-like piece, the foil that would not stay crumpled. He described these things throughout his life, in public forums, and in private conversations, and in the signed affidavit he gave for the record. He maintained the account until he died. It was the same account. He had been 11 years old on the night he described, sitting on a kitchen floor in Roswell in July 1947, holding something in his hands that no one could fully account for, while the rest of the house slept around him, and his father watched him turn the piece over in the light. There is a kind of testimony that does not resolve things. It does not close a question or produce a final answer. It simply places a human being in a specific room at a specific hour with specific objects in their hands and says, "This is what I held, this is what I saw, this is what I could not account for, and this is the account I have carried with me from that night to this one." Jesse Marcel Jr. gave that kind of testimony. What the piece in his hands was made from has not been established. What he experienced in holding it, the particular reality of that late-night kitchen in 1947, a boy on the floor, a piece of something unknown across his forearm, persists in the record the way memories persist when they are put into words, and the words are written down, and the documents are kept. The Roswell Public Library has a reading room. In that reading room, available to researchers who request it, is the Roswell Daily Record of July 9th, 1947. The paper is in a folder, the way old newspapers are kept, handled carefully, because the paper is more than 75 years old now, and old paper is fragile. A researcher who makes the trip to Roswell and sits in that reading room and asks for the paper can hold it. The words printed in the column about Mac Brazel and the debris on his ranch are legible, the ink still dark enough to read, the date visible at the top of the page. Brazel's account is there, In the plain language of a county newspaper interview, the debris as he described it to the record, rubber strips, tinfoil, paper, sticks, is described in those words.